The announcement from the Department of Justice this morning is not a legal filing. It is a declaration of internal war. When Attorney General Pam Bondi authorized a criminal investigation into Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey just hours ago, she did not merely escalate a political feud. She fundamentally rewrote the contract between the American states and the federal government. For 2 centuries, the tension between Washington and the state capitals has been the friction that keeps the engine of democracy running. Today, that engine seized. The Department of Justice is no longer acting as an arbiter of law. It is operating as a mechanism of coercion, designed to convert elected governors into obedient middle managers of the executive branch. And if you think this is just a headline about a distant politician in the Midwest, you are missing the point entirely. This is about whether the vote you cast for your local sheriff or your state representative still matters, or if their authority can be nullified the moment it inconveniences the President of the United States. To understand the gravity of what happened this morning, we must strip away the noise of the 24-hour news cycle and look at the brutal architecture of the event. This did not happen in a vacuum. It began with a bullet. On January 7, 2026, Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3, was shot and killed by an Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent less than a mile from where George Floyd died 6 years ago. That single pull of a trigger did not just end a life. It resurrected the ghosts of Minneapolis. But unlike the summer of 2020, the federal response this time was not to investigate the agent for civil rights violations. The Department of Justice explicitly stated they would not investigate the shooter. Instead, they turned their sights on the officials who dared to question the shooting. This is the new logic of the Trump administration in its second year. It is a logic that views dissent not as a democratic necessity, but as obstruction of justice. The accusation leveled against Governor Walz and Mayor Frey that they actively encouraged protesters to impede federal law enforcement is a legal stretch so audacious it would make a rubber band snap. But legality is not the objective here. Dominance is. By framing the governor's refusal to deploy state troopers to assist federal agents as a criminal act, Washington is establishing a terrifying precedent. It is asserting that state resources are essentially federal assets in reserve, and that a governor's discretion is merely a privilege that can be revoked by a subpoena. And consider the timing. This investigation was launched the morning after the Free America walkout, a nationwide strike that saw thousands of citizens refuse to work on the anniversary of the inauguration. The administration needed a scapegoat. They needed to demonstrate that the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of compliance. Governor Walz, with his frantic attempt to balance state order against federal intrusion, became the perfect target. He is being punished not for what he did, but for what he represents: an alternative center of power. And in the architecture of the ruthless architect, there can be no alternative centers. There is only the center. You need to look at your own life to understand why this matters. You elect your local leaders to manage your schools, pave your roads, and police your streets according to the values of your community. That is the essence of federalism. It is the idea that a family in Minnesota might want to live differently than a family in Florida. But what we witnessed this morning is the death of that idea. If the Department of Justice can criminalize a governor for prioritizing the safety of his constituents over the priorities of immigration and customs enforcement, then local sovereignty is a myth. It means that the police officer patrolling your neighborhood answers ultimately to Washington, not to your mayor. It means your tax dollars are funding a state government that is being held hostage by the federal treasury. The friction here is palpable. It is the sound of institutions grinding against each other until they break. Minneapolis has become a triangle of conflicting authorities. You have the federal government demanding total submission. You have the state government, led by Walz, trying to maintain order without surrendering dignity, placing the National Guard on standby but hesitating to deploy them against their own neighbors. And you have the city government, led by Frey, arguing that sending federal troops is unconstitutional. This is not governance. It is a standoff. And in a standoff, the side with the most guns usually wins. But the victory is Pyrrhic, because the legitimacy of the system evaporates the moment force becomes the only language left. We must also look at the chilling selectivity of this justice. While the Department of Justice moves with lightning speed to indict a sitting governor, the investigation into the agent who killed Renee Good has been preemptively closed. This creates a two-tiered system of reality. In one tier, federal agents possess absolute immunity, shielding them from the consequences of lethal force. In the other tier, elected officials possess zero immunity, vulnerable to prosecution for political decisions. This inversion of accountability is not accidental. It is a design feature. It signals to every federal employee that the state will protect them at all costs, provided they remain loyal to the mission. And it signals to every local official that the state will destroy them, provided they remain loyal to their voters. The market knows this is dangerous. You might have seen the tickers flashing red this morning, but you probably didn't connect it to a subpoena in Minnesota. You should. Wall Street hates uncertainty, and there is nothing more uncertain than a constitutional crisis. When the federal government declares war on a state economy because that is what investigating a governor amounts to, investors flee. They understand that if the rule of law is subjective, then contracts are subjective. If a governor can be targeted for political reasons, then a corporation can be targeted for political reasons. The drop in the futures market this morning is not just about interest rates or oil prices. It is a vote of no confidence in the stability of the American Union. And let us not forget the human element that triggered this systemic collapse. Renee Good. Her death is the tragedy that the administration wishes you would ignore. By focusing the narrative on obstruction and law and order, the White House is performing a sleight of hand. They are trying to make you forget that an unarmed woman is dead. They want you to debate the powers of the governor so that you do not debate the morality of the shooting. It is a cynical calculation, but it is effective. It shifts the battlefield from the streets, where the administration is weak, to the courts, where they have stacked the deck. But the most dangerous aspect of this morning's news is the silence. Not the silence of the streets, which are filled with the noise of the Free America walkout, but the silence of the president's own party. Where are the conservative champions of states' rights? Where are the legal scholars who spent decades arguing that the federal government should not interfere in local affairs? Their silence is deafening. It implies consent. It suggests that the principle of limited government was never a principle at all, but merely a tactic to be discarded when their side holds the reins. This betrayal of ideological consistency is perhaps the most profound casualty of the era. Principles are durable only until they become inconvenient. This investigation into Governor Walz is the crossing of a Rubicon. Before today, the federal government might sue a state. They might withhold funds. They might issue scathing press releases. But they did not treat the governor of a sovereign state as a criminal suspect for exercising his executive judgment. By crossing this line, Attorney General Bondi has opened a door that cannot be easily closed. If a Republican administration can indict a Democratic governor for obstruction, what happens when the pendulum swings? We are normalizing the criminalization of political difference. We are turning the justice system into a weapon of mass destruction against our own political stability. The Free America walkout that paralyzed cities yesterday was an attempt to stress test the system. The organizers wanted to see if the economy could function without the consent of the governed. The answer, apparently, terrified the White House. The decision to escalate against Walz is a panic response. It is the lash of a whip from a driver who realizes the horses are no longer listening. But history tells us that you cannot whip a nation into prosperity. You cannot indict a people into unity. The harder the administration squeezes, the more the legitimacy of the federal structure slips through their fingers. This is not just about Minnesota. It is about the fragility of the peace we take for granted. We assume that the conflict between state and federal power is settled in courtrooms with gavels, but we are dangerously close to a reality where it is settled on street corners with tear gas. When Mayor Frey says that sending federal troops is unconstitutional, he is appealing to a document that the other side seems to view as a suggestion rather than a rule. And when the Department of Justice treats that appeal as a crime, they are telling you that the Constitution means exactly what they say it means, and nothing more. So, as you watch the news clips of protesters facing down National Guard troops, do not make the mistake of thinking this is a local riot. It is a national fracture. It is the sound of the United States forgetting how to be united. The investigation into Tim Walz is the first shot in a cold civil war fought with subpoenas and indictments. And in this war, there are no bystanders. Because when the architecture of the state collapses, the roof falls on everyone. The Department of Justice has made its move. They have placed a bet that raw power can silence structural dissent. They have calculated that the American public is too tired, too distracted, and too divided to care about the intricacies of federalism. They believe that if they make an example of one governor, the other 49 will fall in line. It is a gamble of breathtaking arrogance. And looking at the history of this country, it is a gamble that usually ends in disaster. The investigation into Governor Walz is not a novelty. It is a reenactment. To find the blueprint for what is happening in Minnesota today, you do not need to look at the legal code of 2026. You need to dust off the archives of 1850. Specifically, you need to look at the Fugitive Slave Act and the desperate, violent attempt by a central government to force northern states to become the enforcement arm of a federal agenda they abhorred. In 1850, Washington did not ask for cooperation. It demanded submission. It passed a law requiring citizens and local officials in free states to assist federal marshals in capturing escaped slaves. If a marshal demanded help, and a local citizen refused, that citizen committed a federal crime. If a local judge tried to interfere, that judge was fined. The parallels to the current situation in Minneapolis are not just striking, they are terrifyingly exact. Today, the issue is not slavery, but immigration enforcement. Yet the mechanism of coercion is identical. The Department of Justice is asserting that a state official, Governor Walz, does not have the right to stand down. They are arguing, implicitly, that his oath to the Minnesota Constitution is subordinate to the tactical needs of immigration and customs enforcement. When Attorney General Bondi threatens to prosecute local leaders for impeding federal law, she is dusting off the same logic used by President Millard Fillmore when he threatened to deploy the Army to Boston to enforce federal warrants. Fillmore believed that crushing resistance in Massachusetts would save the Union. He was wrong. It did the opposite. It radicalized the North. It turned moderate citizens, who cared little for abolition, into militants who saw the federal government as a tyranny. By forcing the issue, Washington destroyed the middle ground. And that is exactly what the ruthless architect is doing today. By criminalizing the political decisions of a governor, the administration is forcing every state leader, from the governor's mansion in Albany to the State House in Sacramento, to choose a side. There is no longer a safe harbor of neutrality. But we can go back even further to understand the true danger of this moment. We must look at 1832 and the nullification crisis. When South Carolina declared that it would not enforce federal tariff laws, President Andrew Jackson did not send a subpoena. He asked Congress for a force bill. He threatened to hang the first man he could get his hands on to the first tree he could find. Jackson understood something that the current administration seems to be relearning in the American system. The ultimate arbiter between state and federal power is not the Supreme Court. It is violence, or rather, the threat of violence. The tragedy of 2026 is that we have spent 2 centuries building institutions precisely to avoid returning to the logic of 1832. We built courts. We built arbitration boards. We built a culture of intergovernmental deference. We agreed that Washington would not arrest governors, and governors would not arrest federal agents. That was the peace treaty of the modern era. This morning, the Department of Justice tore that treaty up. By opening a criminal file on Governor Walz, they have signaled that the era of deference is over and the era of the force bill has returned. And history tells us what happens to economies when the force bill logic takes over. In the 1830s, the uncertainty over federal authority contributed to the Panic of 1837. Banks collapsed because no one knew whose laws applied to which assets. Capital is a coward. It runs from conflict. If you are an investor looking at the United States today, you are seeing a country where the rules of the game vary depending on the political affiliation of the prosecutor. You are seeing a sovereign risk that usually belongs in emerging markets, not in the world's reserve currency. You might think this history is abstract. It is not. It is directly connected to the interest rate on your mortgage and the value of the dollars in your savings account. When a constitutional crisis moves from the theoretical to the kinetic, when federal agents and state police are staring each other down over a jurisdictional dispute, the risk premium on American assets skyrockets. The world lends money to America because we are stable. If we decide to reenact the prelude to the Civil War, that stability vanishes, and with it, the cheap credit that fuels the American lifestyle. The echoes of the Nixon era are also vibrating through this news. In 1973, during the Saturday Night Massacre, Richard Nixon tried to decapitate the Justice Department to save his presidency. He fired the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, because Cox demanded tapes. Nixon believed the executive branch had absolute privilege. But notice the difference. Nixon fired his own employee. Trump's Department of Justice is targeting an independently elected official of a sovereign state. This is Nixonism on steroids. It is an expansion of executive reach that would have made the 37th president blush. Nixon wanted to be above the law. The current administration wants to be the law, erasing the distinction between the person of the president and the statutes of the nation. Consider the chilling effect we discussed earlier regarding the press. Now apply that to governance. If a governor can be investigated for encouraging obstruction by sympathizing with protesters, what happens to a mayor who declares a sanctuary city? What happens to a school board president who refuses to implement federal curriculum mandates? The investigation into Walz is a demonstration strike. In military strategy, a demonstration strike is not meant to destroy the enemy's entire army. It is meant to show what you are capable of doing to their leadership. It is psychological warfare. The Department of Justice is putting every local official in America on notice: comply or lawyer up. This historic friction is also creating a constitutional gray zone. In 1861, there was clarity. The South seceded. Lines were drawn on a map. Today, we have something messier. We have soft secession. Texas is operating its own foreign policy on the border with buoys and wire. Minnesota is operating its own justice policy regarding federal agents. The center is not holding, but the pieces are not leaving. They are just grinding against each other. And just like tectonic plates, when they grind, they create earthquakes. The administration's reliance on the Insurrection Act rhetoric, even if not yet formally invoked in Minnesota, is another historical ghost. The act was designed for rare emergencies, to stop rebellion. It was not designed to settle policy disputes between a president and a governor. By treating political disagreement as insurrection, the administration is degrading the definition of treason. If everything is treason, then nothing is. If every resistance is a crime, then crime becomes a badge of honor. This is the lesson of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Federalists tried to criminalize dissent to save the government. Instead, they destroyed their own party and handed the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. Repression often breeds the very instability it seeks to cure. But there is a darker possibility that history whispers to us. Sometimes, repression works, at least for a while. In ancient Rome, when the Republic was fracturing, Sulla marched on Rome not to destroy the law, but to restore it. He used force to purge his enemies and rewrite the Constitution. He brought order, but he killed the Republic. The ruthless architecture being built in Washington today has a sullen quality to it. It promises order. It promises to end the chaos of the streets. And to a frightened populace, tired of strikes and inflation and uncertainty, that promise is seductive. The investigation into walls is the sullen prescription list brought to the 21st century. It says, we will remove the troublemakers, and then you will be safe. The danger for you, the citizen, lies in believing that this is only about politicians. It is not. The erosion of state sovereignty is the erosion of your most immediate line of defense. Throughout American history, the state government has often been the shield against federal overreach. When the Fugitive Slave Act demanded that Northerners become slave catchers, it was state personal liberty laws that protected them. When the federal government tried to enforce prohibition, it was state refusal to cooperate that eventually ended the failed experiment. If the Department of Justice successfully breaks Governor Walz, that shield is shattered. You are left naked before the federal Leviathan. This is the historical echo that should keep you awake at night. We are walking a path that has been paved by previous failures. We are ignoring the warning signs that flashed in 1832, in 1850, and in 1973. The belief that it can't happen here, that we cannot slide into authoritarianism or civil conflict, is a vanity. Institutions are not magic. They are just agreements. And this morning, the Department of Justice announced that the agreement is null and void. We are witnessing the stress test of the American experiment. Can a system designed for compromise survive an era of total warfare? The events in Minneapolis suggest the answer is no. The friction is generating too much heat. And in physics, as in politics, when heat exceeds the melting point of the material, the structure collapses. The America of 1859 looked stable on the surface, but the beams were rotting. The America of 2026 is showing us the rot in high definition. You are asking the wrong question. You are sitting there, perhaps watching this on your phone during a lunch break, asking yourself if Governor Walz is guilty or innocent. That is the question the architects of this chaos want you to ask. It is a trap. The real question, the one that will determine the safety of your family and the value of your assets over the next 12 months, is whether the state line you live within still exists as a legal boundary, or if it has been reduced to a mere suggestion on a map. Because if the Department of Justice can reach into the Minnesota State House and criminalize the executive decisions of a governor, then there is no such thing as local control. There is only federal permission. And permission, unlike a right, can be revoked at any moment. This is not a theoretical debate for law professors. This is a direct threat to your household stability. Look at your driver's license. Pull it out of your wallet and look at it. It bears the seal of your state. It represents a contract that says your state government exists to protect your rights, your property, and your safety. Today, that contract was set on fire. If your governor cannot protect himself from political prosecution, he certainly cannot protect you. If your mayor cannot command the police force without fear of federal indictment, then who is actually patrolling your streets? You are living in a jurisdiction where the chain of command has snapped, and when the chain of command snaps, the rule of law becomes the rule of the strongest. And do not delude yourself into thinking this political instability will not bleed into your financial reality. It already has. Markets crave certainty. And there is nothing more uncertain than a country where the central government is at war with its own provinces. When foreign investors look at the United States today, they do not see the rock-solid republic of the 20th century. They see a sovereign risk. They see a place where the rules change based on who is holding the gavel in Washington. That risk premium is going to show up in your mortgage rate. It is going to show up in the inflation of imported goods. It is going to show up in the devaluation of the dollar. You are paying a chaos tax for this conflict, whether you realize it or not. So, how much time do you have? Not much. The machinery of the ruthless architect is moving faster than the news cycle can track. The investigation into walls is just the opening salvo. Next will come the funding cuts for non-compliant states. Then the federalization of local police forces. The window for you to insulate yourself from this structural collapse is closing. You cannot stop the Department of Justice, but you can harden your own defenses. You can diversify your assets out of the dollar that depends on this crumbling stability. You can build networks in your community that do not rely on a fractured government for survival. This brings us to the brutal choice you must make today. There are no spectators in a constitutional crisis. You are either banking on the iron hand of federal order, believing that this crackdown will restore safety and suppress the chaos of the streets, or you are betting on the defiant shield of state resistance, believing that local sovereignty is the last line of defense against tyranny. I want you to go to the comments section right now and declare your allegiance. Type order if you believe the president must crush dissent to save the nation. Type resistance if you believe the governor must hold the line to save the Constitution. Do not stay silent. In a war of institutions, silence is consent to the winner. Tomorrow morning, do not just wake up and check the weather. Wake up and check the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond. Check the price of gold. Check the statements from your own governor. The America you were born into, the America of clear lines and checked powers, is being dismantled brick by brick. The investigation in Minneapolis is not a legal proceeding. It is the sound of the demolition crew arriving at the job site. The architecture is crumbling. Do not be inside when the roof falls.